Good evening, everyone. I'm Erica Lai, president of APABA-DC. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. By way of background, APABA-DC is the oldest and largest voluntary bar association of Asian American and Pacific Islander, or API lawyers, judges, and other legal professionals in the DC metropolitan area. Although we are a nonpartisan organization, so we do not support or endorse any political candidates or parties, tonight's fireside chat with Congressman Kim falls squarely within our mission of serving as a voice for our community, elevating and promoting our community's advancement, and giving back to our community. For the past 40 years, our organization has worked to, among other things, help diversify the courts and leadership in government, recognizing that representation really matters. And this is especially true after the horrifying rise in hate crimes targeting our AAPI community across the country since the onset of COVID-19, including in the Atlanta area shootings, as well as the violent attacks against our elders, including in New York and California. Several of our nation's AAPI political leaders, including Congressman Kim, who is here with us tonight, have helped bring attention to this very critical issue. And while it is important that non-AAPI leaders also do so, our AAPI leaders can do so in a unique way, poignantly sharing their stories and speaking for our community, just as the Congressman has done. Congressman Kim was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2018 to represent the 3rd Congressional District of New Jersey, which encompasses parts of South Jersey. His 2018 race was the most expensive in New Jersey history. He is the first Korean American in Congress since 1992 and the first Burlington County Democrat to win re-election to Congress since the Civil War. He serves on the House Armed Services, Foreign Affairs, and Small Business Committees. The son of Korean immigrants, Congressman Kim previously worked at USAID and the State Department as a counter-ISIS advisor to President Obama and as a strategic advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen in Afghanistan. I'm also thrilled that our event tonight will be moderated by Phil Olaya, who we at APABA-DC honored with its 2020 Member Appreciation Award for all that he has done for the DC AAPI legal community. Phil is special counsel to the Democratic Commissioners of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He has served in a number of roles over his many years in government and public interest, with a focus on political law and extensive experience in the legislative branch. Phil graduated from Rutgers University School of Law in Newark, where he served as co-editor-in-chief of the Rutgers Race and the Law Review. This fireside chat is the second in a series that APABA-DC is putting on regarding how the government can help combat AAPI hate. We are deeply appreciative of the hundreds of you who tuned in for our event 2 weeks ago with former DOJ Civil Rights Division Deputy Roy Austin and U.S. Attorneys for D.C. and Maryland, Jesse Liu and Rob Herr. We're sharing in the chat box information on upcoming events, including one with State Attorneys General, and next Tuesday's virtual reenactment of a major AAPI civil rights case that will be brought to life by many AAPI and other federal and local judges. I want to thank the Congressman's office and our community affairs team, Anjum Manwala, who actually grew up in the Congressman's Congressional District, and Melissa Nanaka for all their hard work in helping us prepare for today, as well as to all our community co-sponsors for spreading the word. And those co-sponsors are the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, or NAPABA, the Bar Association of DC, the Korean American and Vietnamese American Bar Associations of DC, and the Washington Bar Association. Finally, we'll be reserving some time at the end for questions from the audience, so I encourage those of you in the audience to type your questions into the chat box. Without further ado, I will pass the virtual stage over to Phil.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Congressman Kim, for joining us today. I must say I very much admire your work, and there are many in our membership who admire what you're doing in the United States Congress. So we're really glad to have you here to talk about some of these very important issues. And if you don't mind, we have you for such a short time. I sort of want to jump into something that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, and that's the issue of violence against the AAPI community, especially during this time of coronavirus. When we first confirmed your participation, the incidents against APIs were starting to get some attention. They were still rising, and there were some very graphic incidents of violence against our elders and other community members. And then Atlanta happened. That really showed how dangerous it is out there for our community at this point in time. But it also, showed that we have allies. We have folks who are thinking about us and working side by side with us. I guess, sort of generically speaking, we're about a month out from the Atlanta incidents. Where are we today? Are things getting better?
Well, first of all, thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody, Erica, and all, for having me here today. And I'm glad we have a chance to be able to chat. And very much looking forward to diving in deeper on this. But look, to answer your question, are we better? The answer is no. We're not better off than we were a month ago, or 2 months ago, 3 months ago. First of all, we don't really know where we stand right now. And this has been an ongoing issue that we've had in the API community. We just do not have good documentation, good reporting, good understandings of just the scope and the magnitude of the challenges that we face. And two, the situation is one where, sadly, it's predictable in this country, where we have a tragedy of the magnitude of Atlanta, and there's been an outpouring of support, a lot of attention, but we know how hard that is to sustain. And that's been one of the things that I've been most concerned about, is just how do we try to capture this attention, this energy that we have, and try to turn that energy into real action, and to try to put in place some infrastructure for us so that we can have a better chance of sustaining this. But look, just before I got on here, we got word of another shooting now in our country. I mean, this is just, sadly, something that we've experienced before. What our job is, and what my job is to try to do, is try to make sure that we have the follow through, and try to make sure that we are not only just outraged when it's at the front pages or on the headlines, but we can sustain that kind of action going forward. But it's going to be hard. It will.
So maybe can we talk about some of those actions that have taken place since the Atlanta shootings? The administration recently took some very strong action, especially on the issue of gun violence. And then there are a couple bills in the Senate and in the House that your colleagues have introduced to try to address the issues. Maybe can we start with the administration's policies? What do you think about those? As, not only did they introduce gun violence measures, but I think they want to appoint someone within DOJ, if I remember correctly, to address the specific violence, or the specific issue of violence against AAPIs. Are those measures a step in the right direction? Are they enough? Are there ways you would suggest that they add to it?
Sure, Phil. So let me just start by taking a step back and just giving you a sense of how I see some of this action going forward. So one is, you're absolutely right, there's a government element to this. And this is both in terms of executive actions, executive work that can be done right away, as well as legislative work that we're pushing on in the Hill. And I'll get back to that in a second, since that was the question that you asked. But I wanted to lay out that what we also know is that no single piece of legislation alone that we can pass, or any government action, is going to rid this problem that we face right now. This is a very deep cut in our society, and something that needs to be systemic in the way that we approach this in order for us to heal. This is something that we know is not just COVID related. While the last year has poured gasoline on this fire, and we know how exacerbated this discrimination has been, but we also know that it existed well before COVID. It'll continue to exist after COVID. So those are some key points that I always try to keep in mind. So there's the government aspect of this, but there's also the aspect of this in terms of organizing the API community. And I know we'll go into this most likely later, both politically, but also just, again, that infrastructure, that connective tissue between API communities. We know we're not a monolithic community as well. So how do we strengthen those connections between different groups? That's it. And then the third part of it, which you talked about as well, is building that wider coalition, connecting us into that greater fabric within our own communities, but also just more broadly in terms of being able to gauge other communities of color, other communities throughout the United States. This is something that I do a lot, and representing a district that's 85% white, that's less than 3% Asian American community that voted for Trump. So I'm constantly interacting and engaging with that broader community. But to take us just a step back, we are trying to pass forward some legislation. We have the No Hate Act, as well as the COVID hate crimes legislation that we are moving forward. In fact, I'll be gathering with Senator Duckworth and Mazie, as well as Grace Meng and others to try to make another push at this tomorrow to try to move that legislation forward. It will give more resources to our government to engage on this. Yes, the Biden administration has taken some steps. Some of the steps are to better organize and to coordinate across our government and across our interagency to be able to address this. But I describe it as a good start. But it is not nearly at the magnitude of what I think needs to occur for us to engage, nor have we engaged in the kind of community outreach and dialogue with different communities in the API communities to understand fully what they need to address really a fundamental question, which is, what do you need in order to feel safe? What kind of support do you need to be able to do that? And again, the federal government's not going to be able to provide all of that, but I want to start seeing governors come out with state level action plans. I want to see punch lists comes out from municipalities and towns and cities about what they need. There just needs to be a lot more specificity in this conversation right now in a way that I have not yet seen. So this is something that I'm trying to press for.
That's helpful. I guess sort of related to all of this, a common narrative in the media, even among ourselves in the AAPI community, is that sort of cultural when incidents like this happen for us to not report, to keep our heads down, and to just continue on and not call attention to ourselves. But I want to push back against that a little and ask if it's possible that part of the reason that a lot of these crimes are underreported is because that law enforcement and government just lack the sort of connections to our communities. They don't have the language capacity. They don't have the community outreach to the different AAPI communities. They don't have the relationships within those communities to make community members feel safe and feel like they can report these and get a response and see any reports that they file, see the consequences of those, or maybe it's both. There is that cultural hesitation, but then at the same time, that there's just a lack of resources at the government level or at the community level. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know you've been part of some of those discussions as well.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. And this is, segues well from what I was just talking about in the previous question, which is, what do these communities need? Who's going to the Asian American community in Oakland or down in Atlanta or elsewhere and just going to them just saying, what do you need? What kind of resources do you need in your community? And some of that's going to be about law enforcement, but what we also know is that, again, this is not a problem that law enforcement alone is going to be able to solve. I was down there in Atlanta just not too long ago. I was invited down to meet with the Asian American community as well as the families of the victims. And, first of all, it was just one of the most powerful and challenging experiences of my entire career to go down there, especially with the wounds still so fresh and the community in such pain. It was very difficult to listen to, these families talk about their Korean American mothers in terms that could be used for my own mother, and it was very painful to hear that. And when I asked them, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you want going forward? There was, again, just a lot of feeling like they just aren't being seen and heard, and that they don't have that kind of connection. Maybe they do with the kind of the immediate, community, but more broadly within the state of Georgia or across our country, we don't necessarily feel that connective tissue like we should. And that makes it tricky because it makes it harder for law enforcement to understand the nuances and specificity of the discrimination and bias that the API community faces. And this is something that we think, a certain level of training and other types of exercises, engagements might support. We also don't necessarily, because you don't have that connective tissue that build as strong as it should be, you have a hesitancy on the API community to engage with law enforcement because they don't always know who to contact or who to call. A lot of confusion about what actually reaches the threshold in which you should report something. That's been one of the biggest areas of confusion that I think a lot of people face. And look, I don't have all the right answers either, but this is not something where you need to call 911 for every single incident that occurs. But what is the reporting structure? How can we make that more streamlined? And I've talked to ADL and others as well about lessons learned that we can potentially draw from to be able to do this. But on top of that, there is this broader issue as well that you kind of were getting at in the beginning. One woman that I talked to in New Jersey, an Asian American woman, I asked her about discrimination that she faced, and she said she faced a lot. And I asked her if she reported it, and she said no. And when I asked her why, she said it wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't like I didn't know how to do it, or I was fearful of retaliation. I've heard those a lot. She just said, I didn't do it because I didn't think anyone would care. And I was just really heartbroken by that because I could hear in her voice this sense of isolation, this like loneliness in how she feels, that she just doesn't think anyone cares what the discrimination or the bias or the racism or the vitriol targeting an Asian American woman. No one would really care about that. And I just feel like she's gotten there after just years and years and years of just erosion, of just grinding away at her feeling like she has the agency to be able to react. So again, there's lots of different avenues here, but that connective tissue is an element of this that we need to strengthen and provide in many different ways.
That story about your constituent or the woman in New Jersey, I think is something that many of us, or at least many people we know, have experienced and have felt, especially during this time. I think a recent incident sort of really illustrates that sort of isolation and feeling of helplessness. That incident in New York near the Port Authority and Times Square, where the Filipino woman on her way to church was attacked, and there were bystanders who, at least the way it's been reported, did not take any action, seemingly kind of looked upon it with disinterest and at most generously looked at it with disinterest. And I guess, sort of tied with your conversation about that connective tissue with the community and with the authorities and with other folks and allies, how do we sort of change that? How do we sort of change that mindset? How do we educate people about the community? How do we build those allies? And just at a basic human level, how do we change that lack of concern?
Well, the video you talk about is one that just, it was so hard for me to watch because it was just such a level of just violence on the streets that I've walked so often, around New York City. And you're right, like, what stuck in my head was not just the violence, but the fact that person at the end just closes the door. Like who does that? Who just closes the door on a broken woman lying down after an attack right in front of your eyes? And I feel like that gets at this broader issue that we feel, which is this constant sense of other. This constant sense of foreignness, this constant sense that like we don't belong, which was actually even the word that was often that was thrown at her while this was happening, so that you don't belong here. And I felt like that closing the door was signaling that too. Like you're someone else's problem. You're not my problem. You're not coming into this building. And I think that again, that is a deeper problem that we have in our society, where we have this otherization that keeps occurring. And obviously what we're talking about is an otherization that many of us have experienced and felt over the course of our entire lives. But in general, our society is becoming so siloed, what our understanding of where our realm of responsibility starts and ends is getting smaller and smaller. And I think that that is such a dangerous place to be. You know, we are having this crisis of empathy right now as a society where we are having trouble being able to see each other through this someone, you know, to be able to see the world through someone else's eyes, to walk in someone else's shoes. And I think that that's, you know, just a huge problem of that, which is why I think it's important for us to speak out. You're right, it is hard to speak out. I've struggled with that my whole life. In fact, there was an incident almost over a year ago that happened where I was yelled at on a train by a woman that I sat down next to who thought she was going to get coronavirus from me simply because I was Asian American. And look, Phil, I'd love to tell you that I, you know, stood strong and said the right thing and made that a teachable moment, but I didn't. I ended up moving seats without really saying much of anything. And I regret that immensely. I wish I could take that moment back. And I wish I could have, in the moment, you know, found the right way to handle that and, you know, de-escalate while also making sure I don't let someone get away with that. And I'm sure others watching understand that feeling of regret that I have, and I wish I had a do-over here to do it again. But I didn't talk about that experience for a long time until recently. And I think there's this idea that, like, look, if our community says we want to be seen and heard, then we need to be visible and loud, and we need to find a way to be able to talk about this. But one last point is I want us to also not just talk about this in terms of its relation to the violence and the discrimination that we see now, but I want us to be able to own the narrative too. I want us to come at this from a source of pride. I want us to be able to come at this from a source of education and information, so that we are not just talking about being Asian American and being dictated to by a murderer in Atlanta or, you know, a deranged person in New York City who is attacking people. You know, that's why I think it's important for us to talk about, you know, our contributions, the actions that we are providing, that that our history is interwoven and fundamentally American in so many ways. And I think, you know, with the Heritage Month coming up in May, you know, I hope that's a place where we can come at this from a positive direction too, and really just make sure we can, you know, show that we're proud. Not just we're not scared of being Asian American. We're proud of being Asian American, and we don't want to have that fear overlaying on top of that pride and burying that. So that's the place where I'd like us to engage in, help make sure that we can tell that story of our place in the American story, and come at it from that angle while we're also building out the wide coalition to combat and fight back against the hate and the discrimination.
Yeah, this is certainly an opportunity, this moment in time, to do that and to take that narrative back and educate people about our history here in the United States, which is rich and interesting, and you know, we continue to make contributions, and I think organizations like ours, you know, make a concerted effort to involve not just our legal community, but you know, the wider regional community and nationally as well. So. You know, I just want to maybe touch upon one last issue, well, you know, one last prepared question on the issue of AAPI violence. And, you know, you've talked about this publicly, I think, in Jonathan Capehart's podcast about an incident with your older son at school. This is something that many of us may have experienced as younger children as well. I think you mentioned that, you know, that brought up similar incidents in your past, and a lot of us are parents who, you know, have children currently in school and are trying to prepare them for these types of incidents that hopefully are far and few between, but may inevitably happen. Maybe can you give a little background about what happened and how you've addressed that since that occurred?
Yeah, it's tough to talk about still. So I have two baby boys. I got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And you know, my 5-year-old came home from school one day and said that he just started telling me this story. He said something happened, and he told me how an older kid kept calling him kind of Chinese boy over and over again. And my son, God bless him, he said, I'm a New Jersey boy. That's how he kind of responded, and which is so sweet. But when my son was relaying this to me, it was clear that he didn't understand what was going on, and he didn't understand what was happening, and it just broke my heart, to see this 5-year-old confronting what was potentially the first incident of discrimination that he's faced. It saddened me because I didn't know what to tell him. It saddened me because I knew that this was might be his first, but it's certainly not going to be his last experience with some type of discrimination. In fact, other forms might be much worse. And he then raised it again later in the night when my wife was around, his mom was around. And again, it was like to the point I was just saying about, I could tell he's replaying it, just like I was replaying that incident I was telling you about on the train. My son was thinking about it again, just raised it off, out of the blue again later on the evening. So I could tell it just kind of burrowed into his head, and it was, it's something he couldn't get out of his mind. And it's, prompted in me just this exploration, especially after the conversation I had with Capehart about, what do I tell him? How do I engage with him about what happened and prepare him for this? And without going into all the details, we can if people want, but as I've been kind of exploring, this idea of where to go, I kind of developed up, in my mind at least, sort of 3 main places that I want to get to with talking to him about this. One is I want to start from a source of pride, kind of similar to what I was saying in the previous question. I'm currently in the process of telling him more about our family story, about not just me and my wife, but our parents, their immigration story, what life was like in Korea. I want them to understand our story, our heritage. I want to teach them more about the Asian American culture, the Korean culture. I want them to come at this again from a source of pride. Then I want to move to what I call preparation, which is, I'm going to prepare him for some of the things he might hear and experience. And hopefully if he hears some of this from me and my wife first, it'll take some of the bite out of it that he might experience otherwise. And then third, it's about perspective. I want him to not just understand the discrimination and the problems that he might face, but I want him to understand that we need to stand up against hate in all forms, and that we need to make sure that we're engaged in the effort that really unifies and shows and understands and builds that empathy. Because I can't exclude the idea that he may have biases or prejudices that might come out in the future as well. We are not immune to that. Just because we're people of color doesn't mean that we can have flaws as well in terms of how we engage with others. So we need to check our own privileges. We need to understand the hurt of others, understand that there will be differences and nuances in how the discrimination of others are faced, but that, again, we stand up against that hate in any form that it takes. So that's something that I'm trying to instill. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. If others have suggestions, I'd love to hear it. It's just, what I've been kind of struggling with as a father and how I'm trying to develop a way to be able to speak to him. So those are some of the struggles that my family's gone through. And again, it shows that this situation of foreignness, this otherization, it's not just about COVID. And that's something that I keep, every time I do a news interview or something like that, I always get asked that question. Is this just, is this about the former president? Is this about his rhetoric? And yes, that's an important question to talk about, but I feel like it just doesn't quite get at the heart of what it is that many of us have experienced over the course of our life. And it's important for the broader American community to understand that this isn't just something that popped up because of COVID-19. This is something that runs a lot deeper.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's helpful, not only as a parent, but, for me personally process, that others are have that same experience. And I know my friends and I have talked about how we're going to handle this with our children. And so it's nice to hear you've had those same conversations, you've struggled with that same conversation, and you're in the process of educating your own children about it. And I think, that kind of leads me to this issue of representation, which you've been talking about, and taking pride in our own story and narrative and history here in the U.S. I think in the popular culture, there are more AAPIs who are, getting a higher profile. We're being represented in the media. We're being represented in literature, the arts, etc. But in Congress, we're still a very small minority. I think the AAPI caucus is maybe at 16 total, 15, 16, right? Last Congress, you were the only Korean American in the United States Congress. This Congress, I think there are 3 now. So it's representation at the highest levels of government are still sort of far and few between. I guess my first question related to that is, you've been on all these interviews, post-Atlanta, even pre-Atlanta, talking about this very specific issue to our community. What is it like? Do you feel a burden carrying, the community's views, or having to represent the community and talk about, the challenges that we face? What is that like? I guess in both your personal capacity and as one of the only few members of Congress that is an AAPI.
Well, I feel responsibility to share my experiences, as you kind of noted, and you've seen. I've been speaking very personally about this in ways that are actually very deeply uncomfortable for me. I mean, again, not only are these not stories that I share very often, like I shared recently a story about how when I was a diplomat working at the State Department, I was banned from working on issues related to Korea because I'm Korean American. These types of experiences were ones that are tough to share, but I think I take a responsibility right now to try to push it. But it's also just very personal for me, because I really do believe that the next few weeks will have in our country, and how we handle this situation right now could very well shape the next couple of years, if not longer, of how Asian Americans are seen and what our experience is like in this country. I think that this is an absolutely critically important moment right now, and it's one that will have a huge impact on the kind of country that my kids grow up in, and how people see their way in this community and in this country. So between now and the end of May, end of Heritage Month, I think that there's a strategic opportunity that we have right now to try to push as hard as humanly possible, while we have an opportunity right now. So, I think about it a lot in that kind of way. As I said, I represent a district that's 85% white with less than 3% Asian American population that voted for Trump twice. When I was thinking about running for Congress in 2017, I remember asking, political experts in DC, the part of, people in the Democratic Party as well, whether or not I should do this. And I had so many people tell me, look, you seem like you have a great background and profile, but there's no way you're going to win this district because this is a majority white district. They just blatantly, in fact, they even said, you should think about moving up to North Jersey where there's a lot more people that look like you. That's what they said to me. I just couldn't believe that they were legitimately talking to me in that kind of way. And that's in the Democratic Party too. It was just, was very painful for me to hear that people were determining what I am or am not capable of accomplishing simply because I'm Asian American. And, I hope the fact that I've been able to not just win the seat, but win re-election. And I hope it shows that Asian Americans, we can win not just in Asian American heavy areas, but we can fundamentally win anywhere, that we can have as much of a right to represent any part of this country as anybody else would. So it's hard, but it's necessary. And that's where we want to get towards, and we're trying to push towards. I originally started up a PAC that says, called In Our Hands, which is trying to recruit and identify young API leaders to step up to potentially run for office, things like that. But it's going to take work, and it's going to be something that we need to put concerted effort in. We cannot just sit back and wait for APIs to step up to run. We should be going out there and finding people, training them, encouraging them, moving them forward, giving them opportunities and support. So that's something that I'm very much committing myself to do.
That's great to hear. And you know, that pipeline issue is something that, I saw in the news today that AAPI Victory Fund is started sort of that, they're trying to concentrate its resources to create that type of pipeline and add and train folks to run for office. So that's great to hear. I guess sort of related to that and sort of moving the discussion in this direction, how did you decide to run for Congress? You were a civil servant like many of the folks in our membership. You'd worked in the previous Democratic administration. And then, you went from working on policy to running for office. How did you decide to do that?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, you're right. Like, I was a career civil servant, so I served under both Republicans and Democrats. I was not a political appointee. So I was really like the furthest thing from thinking about getting into the sort of the elected office side of things. It's not something I ever thought about doing. But, for me, it just comes back to this question of impact. Where can I be of impact? And, for me, my home district in New Jersey was one of the most important districts in the country when it came to the 2018 midterm elections. And I just decided that I was going to step up and run, that I was going to, give this my shot to represent my home district. And, it was very much something that built out from being a dad. It was very much my way of just trying to look out for what kind of future my kids are going to grow up in. So I remember I told my wife that I was thinking about doing this. She asked me, what do you think your chance of winning is? And I said, I don't know, maybe 15%. And I think maybe I was being a little generous with that as well. But it was a long shot. I think I was only like 34 or so when I just started running. So it was, it was, when I look back on it, it was a very, very risky situation. But I'm glad that I took that chance. I'm glad that that I was able to get support from a lot of folks that believed in me, that we were able to put together an incredibly strong operation. And again, like I said, win re-election. I was the first Democrat to win re-election in this district since before the Civil War. So, really showed that, we've been able to build something strong. So I'm proud of what we've done.
Great, and congrats to you on that. I'm not sure folks know, but you also had I think you had the most expensive race in New Jersey history. Looks like you're in a strong position leading up to 2022. But I guess the question is whether or not you remain a target for the Republicans to try to flip your district, and then whether or not that's going to again increase the cost of running your next campaign. Sort of related to your, I guess, official role as a congressional member, we have some questions from folks in the audience, people who are tuning in, and someone has asked about, to go back to our previous discussion against the government's role and the Congress's role, a very specific question about the No Hate Act and your opinion on whether or not, how that will go and what people here can do to make sure their representatives and senators know that, they support the No Hate Act.
Yeah. The No Hate Act is, it's an effort that we passed through the House last year, but we have yet to, so what we're trying to do right now is move this forward. This would be something that's not just about API-related hate instances, but just writ large, giving more resources to our government and to, states and local municipalities to be able to combat the scourge of hate crimes. This helps streamline reporting. That helps gives more resources out there for law enforcement and for others to be able to follow up on a reported hate crime. So, this is about increasing the tools that are out there. I don't think we'll have a problem getting it through the House, but when it comes to the Senate side, yeah, we're I don't know. I don't know where things really stand here, and I think that's why it's important for us to to push this forward, as well as that the COVID-19 hate crimes bill that Grace Meng has put forward. These are elements that are just showing that kind of attention, showing that this is something that we're trying to come up with longer term solutions to that'll outlast just the headlines that are out there. So, those are important ones to follow through on. And, let's stay in touch about that. And we certainly need to make sure that we're, letting different members of Congress and senators know about, about this and the importance of this.
And I imagine your answer about some of these gun control measures is sort of the same thing. Are there any particular bills that you think have a better chance of going through both the House and the Senate, or are there? I know there are a number of them, but.
Well, look, if ever there was a bill that should get passed through when it comes to gun safety, is HR 8, the universal background checks for gun safety. That's one that the overwhelming vast majority of Americans agrees with. In fact, I prefer to call it violent history checks rather than just universal background checks, because that's what we're trying to identify. But these are incredibly popular with the American people in terms of their support. But we just have this situation right now where unfortunately so much of the legislation just gets completely caught up in just the hyperpartisanship and the tribalism that exists right now. And that's a real shame. And it's preventing a lot of very important action from being able to be accomplished right now. So, unfortunately, I don't know what the prospects are, but right now, it doesn't seem like it's something that we can get through, anytime, at least in the near future. Hopefully we will be able to in the coming months, if we can apply that kind of pressure.
To know. Sorry to jump around here, but I want to talk again about sort of the pipeline and representation. You yourself have, I believe, introduced legislation recently. You talked about your previous career in the State Department and some of the challenges you faced, people questioning your loyalties because of your AAPI background and your loyalties, and how, other BIPOC employees at the same agency faced similar challenges. Can you talk a little bit about that legislation, why it's important, and whether or not that's something, I think it's specifically geared toward the State Department, but if that's something that can apply across the federal government and then, at the state and municipal levels if they decide to adopt that type of thing?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is make sure that we press forward. This is something that, Ted Lieu and Castro and others have done a good job of working on before. So I'm helping move some of that forward. We want to make sure that we have a government that looks a lot more like the rest of America, and both in Congress and the executive branch and elsewhere. And honestly, we're struggling with that. We struggled with that at the State Department, both in terms of recruitment, but in particular retention, and especially in promotions and the upper echelons of the State Department. It is not reflective of the diversity of our country. And also, part of that is the fact that, when you have policies in place that, for instance, tell me that while I have a top secret security clearance, I'm banned from working on issues related to Korea, that, I'll tell you, that made me feel horrible. It really did. When I received that letter, I wasn't even trying to work on issues related to Korea. The State Department preemptively, just proactively decided to send me a letter telling me that not to even think about it. And that made me question whether or not I could never move up at the State Department and work a job that has global purview, because am I discounted from doing that? because I'm not allowed to work on an important slice of it. And just like this feeling like just that my loyalty is being questioned and that they don't feel 100% comfortable with me. That just lingered on me. And it honestly made me feel very uncomfortable there at the State Department. It was not the reason I left, but I've heard from many others who've experienced this. They've reached out to me since I've talked about this publicly. And some of them have shared with me that that was a contributing factor to them leaving the State Department. So this is important about recruitment. It's about retention. But it's also just, in the end, it's just about fairness. It's about just treating people right, just treating Americans right, and making sure we're not setting up this kind of standard that is just disrespectful in the end, and something that I just think was, needs to end. It still is happening, which is why I'm pressing forward and trying to resolve this. But I'm sure it's happening at other departments and agencies. I'm sure it's happening in other areas when it comes to recruitment and retention and promotion. So we need to make sure that we're pressing on that in order to have a country that's reflective of our diversity. And also, especially with State Department, that is like the face of America abroad. And we keep saying that we love having a diverse face and that we embrace our our diversity. But that wasn't true from my experience. In fact, the diversity seemed like it was something that was seen as more of a threat rather than a benefit. And I think that that's something that we need to make sure we're changing urgently.
Yeah, that brings to mind sort of the issue of representation, educating everybody about our value and what we bring to the table. It seems like a lot of the membership sort of related to that. When we're talking about, educating our allies, educating the community, the wider community, they're interested in trying to figure out how do we start that conversation? How do we start building alliances and rallying others to our causes and making sure that we can, build that empathy. Not just within the API community, but outside of it, so that when incidents do occur, when there are these instances of violence, we can rely on them. How do we start that process?
This is something that I think about in terms of my own community here in New Jersey. I was very proud to be able to bring my family to some of the protests and the marches last summer in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And, that was something that I felt it was important for my kids to participate in. And I think many of us across this country felt heartened by the fact that there was such a diverse coalition that came together last summer and building that type of connective tissue. And not just in the big cities, but in small towns in my district, there were, marches and protests in places I never would have imagined. I think that that's important. And that has been extremely important when it's come recently, where some of those relationships that I built, some of that connective tissue that we built last summer in my community, I've seen how that's come to support the API community, come to support my family and others, as we are going through our moment of confronting this in a very public and visceral way. So that is where it starts from. It starts from, again, understand the pain and the hurt of others, coming from that place of empathy. And for us to not just right now say, hey, everyone, look at what we're going through, but instead also, making sure that this is a moment where we're asking others, how are you doing? What are you going through? The Black community in my area is just just laser focused on the trial that's happening right now. They're going and confronting a lot of different, continued issues and challenges. We need to make sure that we're listening to them and we're asking how they're doing the same way that they're asking how are we doing. And also, when you're talking about how do we promote our history and our pride, I'll be very honest, I know a decent amount of the history of Asian APIs in our country, but I don't know a lot of it. And I honestly don't know too much of where to start for that information. That's been a conversation that I've had with some of my colleagues in Congress as well as in the API community. But just, if people have suggestions, please write in the chat and let me know. And we can find ways to be able to promote that and get that out there more as well. But, that's something where I'm fully admit, with all humility that I have a lot more to learn too. And I have a lot more to understand. And that's something that I need to take upon myself as a responsibility, that if I want others to hear and see us, that we need to be visible, we need to be loud, but we also need to make sure that we're learning as well. And we're educating ourselves too, in order to be able to better inform.
That's interesting. A question just popped up about the types of ways you're educating yourself on these issues, books, podcasts, other medium that you're looking at right now to kind of study up on not just AAPI history, but Black history, et cetera. So if you care to share, what you're reading right now or listening to, I think some of the folks here would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, well, right now I'm in the kind of collection mode in terms of ideas from others. So I'll make sure to stay in touch about that. But what I've been trying to do is connect in with different API communities around the country and just, try to listen and hear in the same way that what I did when I was down in Atlanta, and I was asking, in particular with the conversation with the Korean American community, is, they were really asking me, like, are others outside of Atlanta, out of Georgia, are people still paying attention? Like, how do they wanted the rest of the country to know that there's a very vibrant and exciting and important Asian American community in Georgia, and they don't get the same kind of attention as the community does in maybe New York or California or elsewhere. But that's on all of us to find ways to strengthen those ties and connections. And your organization certainly has a network there. But I challenge you to think about how you lean in and how you take this to the next level. How do you build upon that? And whether that's geographic or by profession and skill sets or others. But right now is a moment for us to think about how we can strengthen that infrastructure and to kind of build on. And then as we do that, we can trade ideas and notes and experiences and information about how we can all improve and become more knowledgeable and be better at being able to be advocates on that. So let's stay in touch about that, and I'll share with you a couple of the things that I come across as I do.
That would be great, and I know a lot of folks would be interested in that. And it is interesting. A lot of times, especially the current conversation that's happening right now, folks are talking about, again, like you said, is this related just to COVID? Is this isolated to COVID? And they forget that almost 40 years ago now, Vincent Chin was murdered, and there was another era of anti-Asian sentiment, and that it stretches back even further to the when there were railroad workers, and so we'll continue to plug you into our efforts, and we appreciate you doing the same.
And just on that point, like, what I want to connect the dots to is yes, you were talking, 40 years ago, a couple decades ago, but I also want us to be all mindful about the trajectory in which we're heading as a nation 30, 40 years out, where, I'm on both the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we, on a daily basis, recognize that the most fundamental global question that we are encountering in many ways is what will be the United States' relationship to China over the coming decades. And the reason I raise that is that is going to be fundamentally a huge part of understanding how the Asian American, the API community is going to fit into here as well. We need to be very careful about that, and we as a country need to figure out how do we engage in a relationship, and likely a very competitive relationship with China, while also making sure that we are not subsuming the entire API community under that viewpoint and under that guise. I say that as someone who witnessed what happened to the Arab American community after 9/11. We've seen, we're constantly haunted by about the Japanese internment and other, other instances in our own country's history. So I'm fearful that we could be potentially entering into another generation of xenophobia if this is a trajectory that potentially heads in the worst possible directions. I don't think we are. I'm not trying to stir the pot or sound alarm bells, but I want us to be mindful about that, about where we are heading, and how what we see globally in terms of this clash of great powers, that this is something that we need to be mindful about in terms of how is that going to affect how we are perceived, how this question of foreignness or xenophobia or loyalties is going to come into question here. So that's something, again, that I'd like to work with all of you on and stay in touch about as we try to think about how we can handle that and navigate that as a country as best as we can.
Yeah, and that seems like an issue particularly, that affects our community in particular, that issue of loyalty and otherness and global events affecting and how they affect us here. So that's interesting that you bring that up, especially with your experience on armed services and with the State Department and having that sort of that global perspective. Gosh, there's just so much more we want to talk about here. I don't want to neglect this. I think one of the events that recently really raised attention to the work you're doing in Congress was a very, I guess, humbling photo of you cleaning up the Capitol after the January 6th riots. Can you just talk to us about sort of that day and what prompted you to do what you did, and why that was important to you at that moment in time when that very important vote was taking place, and when just hours after that incident, you were there.
Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's always hard to think about that day. I mean, it's really one of the darkest days I can ever imagine and remember. For me, I was really overwhelmed with a deep sadness that day. Just, first of all, fear, for my colleagues and for our workplace, but then just this deep sadness of just like, how did we get to this place as a country? How did we get to this place where our democracy is under attack in this type of way? And I remember walking through the Capitol when after the insurrection was quieted and we were back into work. And I was walking through and I got to the rotunda. And the rotunda is, in my opinion, just like the most beautiful space in our country, in our democracy. It's a place that my mother brought me to when I was a child. She was so proud as an immigrant mom to be able to walk me through the Capitol and the White House and show me, just the incredible splendors of our democracy. And, she just raised me to kind of love and respect this country that gave our family all these opportunities. And I just got, heartbroken when I saw this rotunda just in shambles, just cigarette butts put out on statues and broken furniture and trash all over the place. And I was thinking through, like, this is probably actually the worst condition that this rotunda has been in centuries, and just disrespected this temple of our democracy. So I didn't really think about it, but I saw some law enforcement officers eating pizza for dinner, and they were putting their pizza boxes in a trash bag. So I went over, I asked them, do there any more of these trash bags around? And so they pointed to a roll, and I just picked it up and started, trying to pick up the trash in the rotunda. It was very instinctual. I certainly didn't realize I was being photographed or that it would resonate with folks. But when I think of the reaction that people had to that photograph of me, I think it gives me energy that people yearn for and want, and there's a hunger for politics and a leadership in our country that's grounded in humility and decency and respect and service. And that, that's something that I always try to live up to. I don't always get there, but it's something that I strive towards. And it's something that's very much built off of the values that my parents have instilled in me, and values that I'm trying to, as a dad now, instill in my children, which is just so difficult. But that's, I don't know. Those are some of the things. But what it reminded me is that, look, we have a long road to recovery ahead. We have a lot of struggles that we're going to be going through as a country. But what's important is that we don't give up, and that we just, try to give it everything we got. And that's what I hope you guys see in the work that I try to do, is that I'm giving this everything I humanly have to try to help get our country through these tough times right now. And, I just, ask each and every one of you to think about, what is it that you can do? What is it that you can lean in on? Working together in different ways. Again, not all these problems can be solved by legislation, by government. There's lots of things that you all can be doing and working together with. And I look forward to doing that, and I hope we have opportunities to do so.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thank you so much, Phil. I hate to be the one to have to call this chat to an end, but I also know the Congressman has very important work that he needs to return to. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us. You've given us so much to think about. I found this conversation profoundly poignant and honest and deeply insightful. So thank you very much for the thoughtful questions, as well as the profoundly insightful answers as well. And thank you to the APABA-DC team, of course, for all their help with this event, especially Anjum and Melissa, and to the Congressman's office, and to our community sponsors, and to all of the audience members for their support. This is by no means the end of this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, APABA-DC's formal panels on this topic continue on May 12th with a chat with DC and New Jersey Attorneys General Carl Racine and Gerber Gruel, which will discuss both how states can address hate and extremism, but also progressive prosecutors and their impact and effect on the criminal justice system. And because, as we know, there is a long and ugly history of racism and widespread violence targeting AAPIs and other communities of color in America, of which this latest surge in anti-AAPI hate is but the latest awful example, we do hope that you'll join us next Tuesday, April 20th, for our reenactment of the Vietnamese fishermen versus KKK case, which was brought against armed Klansmen who terrorized Vietnamese fishermen in Texas in the 1980s. This critical civil rights case will be brought to life by a number of AAPI and other federal and local judges. We also hope APABA-DC itself will continue to serve as a safe space for our community to process, grieve, and share their thoughts about what we can do to tackle AAPI hate, and as we all try to keep our families safe. We do have an event on AAPI mental health on May 6th with Dr. Christina Hong-Huber, who is an experienced clinical psychologist working from a social justice-oriented and trauma-informed lens, which we encourage our community to join. And we are dropping in the chat box also a link to donate to the AAPI Violence Prevention and Response Initiative, spearheaded by Georgia AAPI lawyers after the Atlanta shooting. We are also all ears as to suggestions for what more we can do, so please really reach out anytime. Thank you very much, everyone. Please be safe, and good night.